Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Steve Blank. Steve is an adjunct professor at Stanford and a senior innovation fellow at Columbia University. Steve, it is wonderful speaking with you today.
Thanks for having me.
So for people who aren't aware of you, your books, or your work, could you just give us a brief background as to your journey in innovation and how you got to where you are now?
Well, I'm glad we only have a half hour because it's been an interesting ride, but I'll try to make it short. I spent 4 years in the military during Vietnam, came out to Silicon Valley in the mid-1970s, and did 8 startups in 21 years. Supercomputers, semiconductors, enterprise software, video games, military intelligence, and I'm missing a couple. But the most interesting part, and I think most relevant for your listeners and viewers, is when I retired, I started thinking about the nature of innovation and entrepreneurship. For those of you who've ever been in startups or been focused on intense projects, you know when you're working on those, your head is kind of down and you're usually not thinking global thoughts or world strategy. You're typically thinking about execution. And so for the first time in 21 years, I actually got to reflect on the nature of innovation and entrepreneurship and how investors were telling entrepreneurs to build startups and how large companies were doing innovation. And what I realized was that everything the common wisdom was telling us was wrong. Back in the 20th century, if you were a startup founder, investors basically told you, without ever saying these words, is that startups were nothing more than smaller versions of large companies. And what that meant was large companies execute known business models, so why don't you go do that as well? But my experience as an entrepreneur said that wasn't the case at all, is that startups actually searched for business models. And what I realized was that we had 100 years of business school theory and management tools for execution of business models. That is, organizational strategy and how to build process and manage programs, etc. We had very few or almost no formal methodologies for searching for business models. And so I developed one, and I wrote a book about it. And that process was called customer development. And the book was called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And that work kicked off something called the Lean Startup movement. And the Lean Startup is now built out of my work in customer development. And then when I started teaching in the business school at University of California in Berkeley, one of my first students, Eric Rees, observed that customer development was paired best with a development methodology called agile engineering. Instead of using waterfall, you could use agile to iteratively and incrementally build what we now call minimum viable products. And so then Lean became customer development and agile engineering. And fast forward about 5 years later, I ran into the work of someone who had just finished his PhD thesis and published his first book called Business Model Design, and it was Alex Osterwalder. And what we realized was the Osterwalder business model canvas was actually the right framework for actually articulating what hypotheses you have in the beginning of a process, and get out of the building and be able to test those hypotheses and actually mark up the canvas as you discover whether those hypotheses were valid or invalid. And so the Lean Startup became business model design, agile engineering, and customer development. And this was all focused on startups to about 2013. And then I wrote an article which ended up on the cover of the Harvard Business Review called Why the Lean Startup Changes Everything. And it gave corporate executives permission to kind of start using tools that were designed for early stage ventures to start using them internally in large companies. And so innovation teams sprung up around lean methodologies in large corporations. We could talk a bit about why that actually resulted in much more innovation theater than innovation. But that's the sum, I think, of my work. Maybe just a couple of other pieces. I finally took all the lean theory, and at Stanford put together a class in 2011 called the Lean Launchpad, which that year was adopted by the National Science Foundation in a program called I-Corps, or the Innovation Corps, to commercialize all science in the United States. And the next year was adopted, or 2 years later, was adopted by the National Institute of Health, who has a version, then the Department of Energy. And I-Corps, my Stanford class, is now taught in 98 universities across the US. And in 2016, myself, Pete Newell, and Joe Felter developed a version of the class called Hacking for Defense, where we actually went out and got problems from our Department of Defense and then let students work on those. That's now a federally funded program taught in 30 universities on how to do innovation on specific problems and domains. That same year, we started Hacking for Diplomacy with Jeremy Weinstein at Stanford to work with the State Department on refugee problems and others. It's now being taught with Scripps and UC Santa Cruz for a program called Hacking for Oceans. And then later this year will be another class called Hacking for Security with Homeland Security. So that's what I've been doing since I've been retired. What was your question?
If there was ever a greatest hits compilation of everything to do with innovation, that sounds like it. I mean, we're touching on business model canvas, we're touching on lean startup, we're touching on new sort of hacking methodologies, and there's a lot to uncover there. We'll try to get through as much of it as possible. But my first question is taking you back to the start of what you were describing, starting up several startups throughout the last couple of decades. And my question is, nowadays, when people hear about startups, they think it has to be a digital product. It has to be a digital service. How has the view of what a startup actually is changed since you began it sort of many decades ago to where it is now?
That's a great question. So when dinosaurs roamed the earth, when I was an entrepreneur, the word startup and investor and venture capital and all had somewhat different meanings. You know, in the 20th century, a couple things. One is that startups that got risk capital, that is venture capital, were limited to just a few innovation clusters in the United States and very few overseas. And the reason, number one, was that there was very little information outside of just having coffee with investors who were funding new ventures. And that was basically Silicon Valley and Boston, and that was about it in the United States. Nowadays, of course, information about how to do a startup is everywhere. Entrepreneurs are everywhere. And that's a big idea. As I said, back then you were limited to essentially your coffee bandwidth, about how many coffees you could have with physical proximity to people who had money and expertise. The second thing that changed is that capital, risk capital, that is people willing to invest in risky ventures, not bank loans, but people who were willing to fund early stage ventures, only again existed in very small innovation clusters. Now, in almost every city or locale or region worldwide, you could raise a seed round almost everywhere, at least pre-pandemic. What we're still limited to is that there's still only a few places in the world that you could raise $100 million. And those are kind of the innovation clusters. But instead of having two, there's probably 10 or 15 of them around the world. The second part that's changed, and I think my work and Reese's work and Osterwalder's work dramatically changed this, is that there's now a methodology for being incredibly efficient about how to reduce infant mortality. That is, how not to die early if you're doing a startup. The lean methodology actually is a pretty cash and time and resource efficient way. And since we've started that, there's hundreds and thousands of books and literature on how to build startups. None of that existed in the 20th century. To answer your question about entrepreneurship is digital, that's just because that's just simply wrong. Entrepreneurship is and always has been a series of marketplaces. It's just that the popular press covers specific domains. And I have to tell you, if you think it's all digital, it's obviously you're not reading the blogs and resources about life sciences. In the 20th century, life sciences, therapeutics, that is drug discovery, medical devices, diagnostics, and digital health were all funded by the same VCs who today fund only digital stuff or only hardware. But those businesses became so specialized that the press, the investors, the entrepreneurs kind of bifurcated and don't even live in the same worlds anymore. The same kind of happened with hardware and software. Those used to be, again, the same investors, same entrepreneurs, et cetera. They've bifurcated as well. So to think of these as no longer occurring just means no, they're no longer occurring in the domain that you're familiar with, but they are occurring. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So we've touched on startups. I'd like to sort of touch on lean and lean startup because the origins of lean, I think, are going to be very, very interesting for people. There might be one or two people who've been living in the cave in the innovation sphere who aren't sort of in touch with lean startup over the last couple of years. But what was the sort of the singularity of how lean startup came about? What did it evolve from? What was the frustration you saw to lead you to develop a different way of thinking?
So in hindsight, and it's only hindsight, I actually, in my 21 years as an entrepreneur and 8 startups, began to practice some of these methods I'll describe in a second. But it was only when I retired, as I said, that I actually had time to reflect on what worked and didn't in my career. And believe it or not, I thought one of the things the world needed when I retired was my memoirs. So I started writing the history of what I did in each one of those 8 startups. And I still remember, we got to page 80, my wife and kids were out skiing. I was locked up in a ski cabin. It was snowing outside. And literally, I'm writing up another summary of what I learned. And the hair started standing up on the back of my neck when I realized that there was a repeatable pattern I had never noticed and no one else had ever written about. And that pattern was that there really were no facts inside your building. And that when I actually started companies and got out and talked to customers early on and engaged them early on, I tended to succeed. And by this time, by the way, I was sitting on boards of public and private companies, and I realized that pattern was not just a Steve Blank pattern, that was a pattern of almost every company I've been engaged with, that there are no facts inside the building. And so the first heuristic of lean was this observation that success and failure was kind of differentiated from founders who thought they were smart enough to not only think they understood a customer problem, but were sitting in their building thinking that all they needed to do was build the solution in toto and then ship it. And then, the only problem they were going to have was they were building big enough to hold the bags of money that were going to come. And I realized that never happened. What happened was startups used to write business plans, which are things that investors made you write that they never actually read. And they would execute them, and investors would fund the plan and a 5-year forecast, which was like trying to predict the future. But then when you got outside the building, the facts didn't match the plan. And it would create all kinds of cognitive dissonance and fire the VP of sales and fire the VP of marketing, eventually fire the founder. And so the epiphany was a couple of things. One is, as I said, the meta observation was startups are not smaller versions of large companies. Large companies execute, startups search. Number two is there are no facts inside the building, so get the heck outside. Number three is that all early stage ventures or new ventures inside of large companies, all you have on day one, and this is just hard to grasp, particularly the smarter you are, the harder this is to get your head around, is that all you have on day one is a series of untested hypotheses, which is a fancy word for just saying you're effing guessing about most of your business model. You might have some core facts like some technology works, or here's a technical idea, or if you're an existing company, here's our existing channel or whatever. But almost everything else about a new product and new business is just a set of guesses. And so how can we rapidly test those guesses? And that's the whole core of Lean, is how do we rapidly reduce risk by building an evidence-based entrepreneurship process? And the emphasis on it is on evidence. And so we just simply take everything of who are our customers. That's a hypothesis. Let's get out and run some experiments. And in fact, Lean is nothing more than the scientific method. It's have a hypothesis, design an experiment, run the experiment, get some data, derive some insight, and either validate the hypothesis, invalidate it, or modify it. And you do this about customers, about what features do you want, et cetera. And essentially the business model canvas allows you to keep score of all those hypotheses. And for most businesses, the two most important ones are who are the customers and what features do they want, what products do they want. And that has a special name called product market fit. And once you find product market fit, then you could test, how do we create demand? How do we keep customers? What's our revenue strategy? What's the right channel? What are the right costs? Do we need partners? What kind of activities and resources do we have to have? And all these are iterative cycles by building what we call minimum viable products, which is a fancy word for not a prototype, but what gets us the most learning about testing a hypothesis at any point in time. And that could be a wireframe, that could be a dummy price list, that could be a cardboard mock-up, that could be something else that allows us to learn as rapidly as we can. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it certainly does. And I'm a big fan of the lean startup mentality, and especially the new revolutions that lead to validation of ideas. There's two phrases which really came out of Eric Ries's book when I got into the lean startup method. One was minimum viable product that we've talked about now. The other was this idea of pivot. And I think pivot really is one of those concepts that a lot of people talk about, but don't really understand what it is or when it should be used. I think a lot of companies say that they're pivoting, but they don't know what they're pivoting from or what they're pivoting to, or whether they should pivot, stick, or kill an idea. What's your view on pivoting and the problems with it?
Yeah, so let me explain probably some of the context for pivot, and again, trying to remember what it was like before we even had the idea. In the 20th century, when you built an early stage venture, or even inside a large corporation, when you started a new product or new division, you would write a plan, and you would have to sell that plan to executives inside a corporation or venture capitalists if you were doing a startup, and they would validate that plan. And the plan meant, you know, here's the schedule of when we're going to ship, here's our revenue plan and operating plan and cash flow, et cetera. And you would execute just like that plan was written on stone tablets given to you from high and above, without much input. And so you would go through a long development process and do something called first customer ship. Everybody would celebrate that the product was done, like magic will happen, and then a VP of sales would get out and try to sell the product. And what a surprise, you know, most of the time, you didn't get the features right, or you didn't get the customers right, or the pricing right, or something. And you know, the sales wouldn't happen like you thought. And so the first thing you would do is fire the VP of sales. New VP of sales would come in, and she or he would look around and say, well, the first one was an idiot. Let's change the strategy. And what you didn't realize, what you were doing was, after that long cycle, when you fired the VP of sales and the new person came in, that was actually a pivot. A pivot was a fundamental change to one or more components of a business model canvas. You either change the customers or the product or the pricing, et cetera. But in the 20th century, it took months, if not years, to do a pivot. And by the way, if that didn't work in a startup in the 20th century, the next person you fired is the VP of marketing, because you blamed it on positioning or we're not describing it right. And the new VP of marketing would change that strategy, another pivot. Now in the 21st century, we kind of realize, well, that's dumb. If all we have are hypotheses on day one, what we want to do is get out of the building and discover whether they're correct or not. And so when we have enough aggregated data to say, this component of the business model canvas, our customers, we're just got them wrong. We have data that says they're not over here, they're over here. Well, once you have enough data, you can make a substantive change to one or more parts of the business model canvas. That's a pivot. What a pivot isn't is attention deficit disorder. And unfortunately, the downside of having this concept is that it allows founders to take the last person to blow in their ear, run back to their company, and turn the development group upside down and saying, well, here's what I heard, let's go pivot. That's not a pivot. That truly is destructive and attention deficit disorder. And so the art of entrepreneurship is understanding when you have sufficient data. And what's the art? Well, if you're building a B2B enterprise software package, that might be, I got 10 or 15 customers willing to write 5, 6, 7-digit checks. That might be sufficient data. But if you had the same number of customers in a web or mobile app saying the same thing, you're probably off at least 2 orders of magnitude of having sufficient data to make a decision. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. At the beginning, when you were talking about the history of lean startup, you also touched on something which a lot of us are seeing recently, which is innovation theater coming to the forefront a little bit. And I sensed a bit of frustration in your voice there. What do you think has been causing innovation theater? What do you think is the impact it's had and where it's going?
Well, it wasn't frustration you heard, it was guilt. The fact that now large companies could look at startup tools and say, oh, I get it. All I need is to set up an internal incubator or hire tech stars. And, now we could bring dogs to work in our corporate incubator and we have posters and coffee cups and lanyards. We must be innovative. And just like we realized startups were not smaller versions of large companies, I think it's dawning on large companies that the large companies are not bigger versions of startups. Startups could do things that large companies can't. Let's start with the most obvious, or maybe not the most obvious. Startups could break the law. Airbnb, Uber, Tesla were all predicated on saying, well, yeah, there are these existing laws, we have nothing to lose, but if we're right, the market's worth tens of billions of dollars, so let's break that. You could just imagine your corporate counsel coming into, the CEO of Marriott or Hyatt that says, oh, we're now going to rent out apartments of people. It just doesn't work. The other is, in a startup, 100% of the people are focused on innovation. In an existing corporation, 99% of them or more better be focused on execution. And the consequence of that is when you have a large company focused on execution, which is kind of their business, you build process, procedures, KPIs, which, if you're not careful, end up strangling innovation in its crib. And so large corporations need to figure out how to build 2 tracks that operate in parallel. In fact, in the 20th century, there was this idea, which is still valid, called the ambidextrous organization, which simply says you have to learn how to chew gum and walk at the same time. But the lean startup methodology used inside of a company really, in most corporations, just end up building these incubators without fixing all the other processes that need to allow innovation to actually deliver a product, not just deliver demos. And that is kind of the output of most innovation activities in large companies, not because people are being dumb, but actually changing these processes and procedures to allow innovation to deliver stuff is actually the tougher part. Not that large companies don't have innovators, is that the whole company has been organized around execution. Did that make sense?
It certainly does. We're coming up to time, but I'd like to get your one final parting thought on something. What's one trend or topic you see changing in innovation and innovation management recently that is really catching your attention?
Well, I think people are now realizing, in at least large companies, that if we're serious about making innovation happen inside of a company, that is, instead of just acquisitions or partnerships, we're going to have to figure out how to have kind of an innovation doctrine, meaning what are the top level heuristics that allow companies to both innovate and execute simultaneously. So that's what I see going on inside of boardrooms and at C-level suites is, what's our doctrine? That is, what are the meta rules for how we want innovation to happen? And for startups, I think given this this world of economic uncertainty this year and probably next, I think we're seeing startups go back to basics. I think there certainly will be new startups that arise in this rubble of economic downturn, but I think we're also going to see startups go back to blocking and tackling and figure out about these things called revenue and profitability. And we know how to do that. It just wasn't important in the 21st century. In the 20th century, that's actually how investors taught founders to build their companies, because there was no way to get liquidity unless you had revenue and profit. In the 21st century, those were no longer the requirements.
Steve, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you. I think everyone listening has learned a lot. If they want to learn more, learn about you, your thoughts, or what you've got going on, where's the best place they can go to find out more?
I have a website called steveblank.com, and you could read all about lean startup, customer development, and culture, and other things that innovation folks inside and outside companies might need to know.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get that link down in the description below. Steve, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they are backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.